So Halloween keeps approaching and we keep doing our series on scary stuff. And today I want to talk about my favorite kind of scary story, which is the ghost story. When I first moved to England in the 90s, I fell in love with it instantly. I mean, I'd always liked England, but I fell in love with living there, and I was just having a wonderful time. And we got there, I guess, in the summer to get the kids into school. And as Christmas approached, we got to see the beautiful London Christmas, and it was lots of fun. And one night, Christmas Eve, it was Christmas Eve. I put the kids to bed. My wife was asleep, and I poured myself a drink, and I turned on the TV. And it was just midnight. It was just at midnight, and a show came on called Ghost Stories for Christmas. And I thought, I have died and gone to heaven. It was like, I thought how wonderful it was that they were telling me English ghost stories on Christmas Eve. I can't account for why I love ghost stories so much. I've thought about it. What is it in my psychology that just makes them appeal to me? And I just can't entirely account for it, but the British love them. The British have more ghosts and more ghost stories than anybody else, and they're better at telling them than anything else. One thing I love about them is that they're subtle. The point of a ghost story is not to scare you or to horrify you, but to give you a sort of eerie feeling. You know, there's a book called Creeps by Night, an old collection of scary stories that's collected by Dashiell Hammett, and in it he says something that the stories are just meant to cause a momentary shudder when what can't possibly happen happens. And he said because of this, the ghost story is usually short because it's just this one subtle moment when something changes, right? It's when you think you see something out of the corner of your eye that changes your entire sense of reality. And that's a very subtle thing, and it's usually a short story. Sometimes movies, very few good ghost novels, though there are some. Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, Stephen King's The Shining, The Woman in Black by Susan Hill, also made into an excellent play. The movie was terrible. There was a recent novel by Sarah Waters called The Little Stranger, also made into, I thought, a mediocre film, but the book is very, very good. The Haunting of Hill House did have a great movie made of it in 1963. It's also had bad versions of it. The most recent one was a Netflix version. I think it was called The Haunting of Bly Manor. But The Haunting of Hill House was made in 1960. No, that was different. But The Haunting of Hill House was made in 1963. And what makes it so good is a scene like this. It's about a group of people brought together in a haunted house. And one of them is played by Julie Harris, and she's a sexually repressed woman. And Claire Bloom is another one, and she is a flirtatious lesbian. And Julie Harris and Claire Bloom are in two separate beds, but lying together, and it's dark, and they hear voices in this haunted house, this evil house, and they start to hold on to each other's hands. And here's that scene from 1963.
I will take a lot from this filthy house for his sake, but I will not go along with hurting a child. No, I will not. I will get my mouth to open right now, and I will yell, I will yell. Stop it! What? What? No, what? Whose hand was I holding?
She wakes up, if you couldn't see it, she wakes up and the two beds have been separated wide apart, and she couldn't possibly have been holding Claire Bloom's hand. Whose hand was I holding? And that's the moment when what can't have happened happens, and you don't even know, you don't even know if it's in her mind or what it is, but it just totally changes everything. And some critics have said that the ghost story reached its peak during World War I or before after World War I, when this kind of sea of death washed over Europe. Europe was beginning to crumble as a culture, and people got very interested in mediums and spiritualism and contacting the dead. But that's just obviously not true. The great age of the English ghost story started before that with the Victorians. And the master of the form, and the guy who was sort of seen as the center of the British ghost story, was a guy named Montague Rhodes James. H.P. Lovecraft pointed him out as the great practitioner of the ghost story. He was a Cambridge medievalist scholar, and he used to gather his lads about him on Christmas Eve after the service and read them his latest story. which is wonderful. And that was the Ghost Story for Christmas. When I saw the show in England, the Ghost Story for Christmas was in fact an M.R. James story. Then they were mostly, I think, M.R. James stories. And like most ghost story writers, this is true of all the great ghost story writers. They only have about 5 stories to tell. So if you read M.R. James, you only want to read a few of his stories at a time. After that, they start to get repetitive. But a typical one has a kind of academic, a non-believing academic who stumbles on some ancient curse and finds out that there's more to it than he thought. One of them was made into a wonderful, wonderful TV show, which is available, I think, on YouTube. It's called Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad. And it was made in 1968 by the great Jonathan Miller made it, and it has Michael Hodern in it as the professor. Michael Hodern, you may know if you've ever seen the greatest version of A Christmas Carol with Alastair Sim. Michael Hodern plays Jacob Marley. He plays the ghost of Jacob Marley. And he's a professor, and he finds a whistle, and the whistle has an inscription. An ancient whistle has an inscription on it. It says, "Who is this? Who is coming?" And he blows the whistle and he finds out. And there's this wonderful scene where this kind of distracted, kind of pompous college professor, whatever he is, an academic, is confronted in the breakfast room of his hotel. And here's Michael Hodern delivering an absolutely spectacular performance.
Do you believe in ghosts, Professor?
Ghosts? That's rather a sticky one, isn't it? I'm not quite certain what you mean. I mean, I'm never quite certain what I'm being invited to believe when anybody asks me a question like that. I'm not even quite certain what I'm being invited to disbelieve when it comes to that.
Not quite with you, old chap.
No, well, I mean, you ask me, do I believe in, say, Australia? Well, now I know perfectly well what sort of thing I'm being asked to judge. I mean, we all agree what we mean by Australia. Large continent, southern hemisphere, discovered by Captain Cook, 4 or 5 large cities, kangaroos, and so on and so on. And given that, one can perfectly well imagine the sort of procedure that one might put in hand to confirm or, on the other hand, to disconfirm its existence. It's not quite the same thing with ghosts.
That's great. It's a great performance. But this, I think, captures one of the essences of the ghost story and why it became popular when it did in the Victorian age. This is when the idea of scientific materialism, the idea that science had completely disproved any spiritual aspect to humankind, begins to make its conquest of the human mind. We've talked about this before. We had that wonderful interview with Stephen Meyer where we talked about the fact that really that's obsolete. But at this time in the Victorian era, it had really become the great idea that was now moving in. The science was going to disprove all spiritual activity. And yet, you have the sneaking suspicion that there's something else right beyond our ability to perceive. And it's not something like witches. It's not aliens. It's not something horrific. It's just that faint thing of something that goes on beyond life, that goes on after death. And so the trick of writing a ghost story, I think, is capturing that uncertainty. Did this really happen? If you just, there's a story by A.S. Byatt, a novelist, wrote a good novel called Possession. She has a story called The July Ghost, where the ghost is clearly an emanation of a psychological grief that this person is experiencing. It's just not scary. It's not interesting when the ghost is totally psychological. But when the ghost is too solid, when it's too real, then it just becomes a monster story. There is this wonderful, wonderful netherworld between the psychology of something and our ability to perceive it. Because as we've talked about before, everything that we see is partly our creation. Everything that we see is only as we see it, is perceived by the human mind. And that's why I think possibly the greatest ghost story is Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. Henry James, one of the greatest novelists. I can call him an American because he was born an American, but he actually became an English subject later in life, and he really is a British writer in so many ways. This is the one that they filmed on Netflix. This is the one when I said The Haunting of Bly Manor, I think, was based on The Turn of the Screw. But The Turn of the Screw is also the inspiration for what I think is the greatest ghost movie ever made. And whenever I've talked to directors who specialize in horror, they all say, oh, yes, if only I could make a ghost story like this. But they can't because it's too subtle. This is the movie The Innocents, made in 1961, also in black and white, like the picture of The Haunting. It stars the wonderful actress Deborah Carr, but the most important thing about it is the screenplay is from William Archibald's play of The Turn of the Screw. It's called The Innocents, but it was also written by Truman Capote, the great writer, and I think Capote probably had a lot more to do with it. I think he doctored the script. It's so brilliantly written, and it also has some extra scenes and dialogue by John Mortimer, who writes the wonderful Rumpole of the Bailey mysteries, and also is the father of the actress Emily Mortimer, wonderful actress. And it's so well written. And so The Turn of the Screw is about this governess, sexually repressed governess, probably comes to take care of these two children in a country house, and they're butter wouldn't melt in their mouth, the two most innocent, sweet little boy and girl in the world, and yet somehow she begins to think that they are seeing something that nobody else can see, seeing somebody that nobody else can see. And here's this one scene, and you have to listen to it really carefully. Every line is so beautifully written to just suggest the fact that this entity that is haunting this house is psychological, but it's real as well. It's both. It's both things, and you cannot separate the psychology from the reality. It is a wonderfully written scene. Listen to it because it's very subtle. She's putting the girl to bed and telling her to finish her prayers.
Finish your prayers, dear.
If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Amen. Miss Giddens, where would the Lord take my soul to?
To heaven.
Are you certain?
Yes, of course, because you're a very, very good girl.
But I might not be. And if I weren't, wouldn't the Lord just leave me here to walk around? Isn't that what happens to some people?
Oh, whatever was that? I'm sure something's been hurt. An animal.
We must pretend we didn't hear it. That's what Mrs. Gross always says.
Pretend?
Then we won't imagine things.
Oh, sometimes one can't help imagining things.
Such a brilliantly written scene because, even the little mistake she makes in praying, if I should wake, instead of if I should die before I wake, if I should wake, and then, don't people just walk around and you're not supposed to hear things, our babysitter, the maid says, because then you won't imagine things. So we're getting the sense that this little girl with her absolutely sweet face sees something, and this poor governess starts to think sometimes you can't help but imagine things. But the question is what she is imagining, is it really there? And there's no way to separate the psychological from the real in either the great novella Turn of the Screw or that wonderful movie version of it, The Innocents, best ghost movie ever made, bar none. And there's nothing even close. The last truly great ghost story writer was a guy of the M.R. James School, the British ghost story. It was a guy named Robert Aikman, writes wonderful, weird stories. And the thing is, what he does at some point is he takes things beyond the psychological and just sort of says, they're so real that and yet they also represent the psychological. He has this great classic story, which you should read, called Ringing the Changes. Robert Aikman, Ringing the Changes. And it is about this older man who's married a younger wife. He comes to a little town, a seaside town, where they're going to honeymoon, and all the bells in the church towers are ringing until it drives you absolutely insane. And everybody around them is starting to get very, very nervous and starting to get drunk, and they don't know why. And finally, this is a radio BBC adaptation. Somebody explains to him why they're ringing the bells.
My wife doesn't mind the bells. In fact, she rather likes them.
Take her away, man.
In a day or two, perhaps. I admit that we're disappointed with Hollyhaven.
Now, while there's still time, this instant.
They can hardly go on practicing all night.
Practicing?
And what else?
They're ringing to wake the dead. No, they are.
It's a figure of speech.
Not in Hollyhaven.
I beg your pardon?
No one can tell you how long they have to go on ringing. It varies from year to year, I don't know why. You should be all right up to midnight. In the end, the dead awake, first one or two, then all of them. Tonight, even the sea draws back. In a place like this, there are always several drowned each year. Most of them come not from the water,
But the earth, it is not a pretty sight.
It's a great story, Ringing the Changes by Robert Aikman. And the great moment in the story is when the ringing stops, because that's the moment when you shudder, because you realize that what can't be is, and what can happen is about to happen. And that's what the ghost story is all about, that our sure and certain sense that they've tried to beat out of us, the materialists have tried to beat it out of us, but our sure and certain sense that there is something there behind the screen of reality that is just out of sight and sometimes slips into our view and causes us to shudder, we know not why. The ghost stories are just wonderful. These are some of my favorites, but there are so many more, and we'll talk more about more scary stuff next time. If you like this great content, and why wouldn't you? It's great content. Subscribe, like us, ring the bell, dance around the room, and we will send you more great content like this.